Thousands of years ago, a man sat on the ground holding two ordinary stones. He had no idea that in the next few seconds his hands would create something that would reshape the next several thousand years of human history. He wasn't trying to invent anything. He was just striking the stones together, out of boredom, the way a hand fidgets when the mind is somewhere else. And then, sparks flew. Near him lay a small pile of dry leaves. The sparks landed on them, and the leaves caught fire. The man jumped back in shock. The boy panicked. He ran straight to his village, shouting for everyone to come see. The whole village gathered. Everyone stared in confusion. Nobody understood what this thing was or what it was supposed to be used for. Some were afraid. Others were simply curious. Then, almost without thinking, the boy, still holding his raw meat, set it down near the flames, just to see what would happen. Within minutes, the meat had cooked through. The smell spread across the entire village. When the fire finally settled, the villagers picked up the cooked meat and tasted it, and it gave them a pleasure unlike anything they had experienced before. Now, whether this exact scene happened this exact way is something we'll never know for certain, but the science behind it is very real. Cooked food is dramatically easier to digest than raw food, requiring less chewing and delivering more usable calories. The news began traveling from one village to the next. People visited neighboring settlements, carrying a burning ember or a lit branch with them, showing it off. Before long, word had reached nearly every community nearby. Before, once darkness fell, there was nothing left to do but sleep. Now, in the glow of firelight, people stayed awake. They shaped their tools, crafted weapons, and worked long after the sun had gone down, something that had simply been impossible in the dark before. Some danced by the fire, celebrating in joy or marking a successful hunt. Elders told stories, children sat around listening, and those stories carried forward into the generations that followed. Slowly, people learned to get even more out of fire. Wood was hardened near the flames to strengthen tools. Clay pots were fired to make them stronger and more durable. Some used fire to keep wild animals at a distance, some for cooking, and some simply for warmth. This wasn't confined to a single region. Over years and generations, it spread across the entire world. Every settlement, every tribe, adopting fire in its own way. And during this time, something else changed. People were no longer limited to just tending fire. They had learned to make it themselves. Wherever fire was needed, people picked up two stones and struck them hard against each other. Sparks flew, and nearby dry wood and leaves caught flame. They no longer needed to search for a burning branch. Whenever the need arose, they could create fire with their own hands, on their own terms. Here's where the story lines up with something real. At a site called Barnham in Suffolk, England, archaeologists found two small fragments of iron pyrite, sometimes called fool's gold. These fragments don't occur naturally anywhere near that site, meaning someone carried them there deliberately, specifically so they could strike fire whenever needed. Researchers led by British Museum archaeologist Nick Ashton concluded that Neanderthals, roughly 400,000 years ago, were striking pyrite against flint to throw sparks onto dry tinder, in almost exactly the way this story describes. This is the earliest confirmed evidence anywhere in the world of humans deliberately manufacturing fire, rather than simply finding it already burning. But even this wasn't new in the grand scheme of things. Long before anyone struck a spark on purpose, humans were already living alongside fire. At Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, researchers found ash and burnt bone in layers dated to somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 million years old. The likely occupants were early Homo erectus, and there's no evidence they were making that fire from scratch. Africa's grasslands burned constantly, so these early humans simply reached toward a wildfire, pulled out a burning branch, carried it home, and kept it alive, feeding it just enough to survive. If it went out, they had no way to start another one. So the moment in our story, when people first struck sparks from stone with their own hands, represents an enormous leap forward in that much longer timeline. The moment humans stopped being mere caretakers of fire and became its creators. And that same curiosity kept pushing forward. Someone heated a stone in the fire and watched something shining separate from the rock itself. This part of the story isn't fiction anymore. At a site called Belovode, in what is now eastern Serbia, archaeologists found the oldest securely dated evidence of copper smelting anywhere on the planet, dating back roughly 7,000 years. People were heating copper ore in a controlled fire hot enough to physically separate metal from stone. That's not a campfire anymore. That's a furnace, deliberately tuned for a chemical transformation. From that discovery, metallurgy spread and evolved into the Bronze Age, and eventually the Iron Age. Swords, plow blades, nails, an entire foundation of human tools and technology, all made possible by that single breakthrough. For thousands of years afterward, the method of making fire barely changed. Flint struck against pyrite, or later the fire drill, remained the standard technique across most of the world. People still needed skill, patience, and the right material. And for a very long stretch of time, the smarter strategy usually wasn't striking a brand new flame from scratch. It was keeping the fire you already had alive, passing that responsibility from person to person, sometimes across entire generations. Then, in 1712, an Englishman named Thomas Newcomen built the first practical steam engine, designed to pump floodwater out of coal mines. Decades later, Scottish engineer James Watt radically improved the design, cutting coal consumption while increasing power output. By the 1770s and 1780s, Watt's engines were spreading into mills, mines, and factories across Britain. In the year 1700, Britain mined just under 3 million tons of coal annually. By 1870, that number had climbed past 30 million, and steam power was providing roughly 90% of all industrial horsepower in the country. This was still fire, controlled, industrial scale, continuous, burning inside iron boilers instead of stone hearths. And then came a small accident that changed fire more completely than anything since that first Neanderthal struck pyrite against flint. In 1826, inside a small chemist's shop in Stockton-on-Tees, England, a pharmacist named John Walker was mixing an experimental chemical paste, completely unrelated to fire. While stirring it with a wooden stick, he scraped the stick against the stone hearth to clean it off. It burst into flame. Walker recognized immediately what he was holding. He refined the mixture, a combination of antimony sulfide, potassium chlorate, and gum arabic, coated cardboard strips in sulfur, and by the spring of 1827, he was selling his invention under the name Friction Lights. He was advised more than once to patent the idea. He chose not to, believing that if something could genuinely help people, it should simply be allowed to spread. Within a few years, matches were being mass-produced and sold cheaply enough that almost anyone, anywhere, could carry fire around in a coat pocket. Now think about the timeline. From 1826 to today is close to 200 years. Against a backdrop of nearly 2 million years of fire history, that's barely a rounding error. So here's where all of this lands. For close to 2 million years, humans could only find fire and guard it, like something borrowed and easily lost. For roughly 400,000 years after that, they could strike it themselves, but only with the right rare stone and hard-won skill. For 7,000 years, they used that fire to melt stone into metal, building the foundation of tools and civilization itself. And in the last 200 years, practically nothing on this timeline, fire became something you could buy for a few cents, or something that appears the instant a thumb rolls a small plastic wheel, so ordinary now that we barely register it as fire at all. And yet the old wiring never got the memo. Something in us still watches a flame the way our ancestors did, still finds it calming, still finds it worth paying attention to, even when there's nothing left to fear. Evolutionary anthropologists point out something almost funny about modern life. Browse real estate listings anywhere, and homes are still marketed by their number of fireplaces. Not because anyone truly needs one for heat or cooking anymore, but because something in us still responds to it, still wants it in the room. The flame on your stove tonight, or the one flickering in a fireplace nobody strictly needs, is answering an attention system that has been running for nearly 2 million years. Built for a world where fire was rare, guarded, sometimes lost for good, and always worth watching closely. Only the ease is new.